And we are live on the Voice of the Cape Facebook page as well as YouTube for our VOC Matric Revision session. And today we cover history, and we will be, or our guest rather, Danielle Pretorius from Futures Academy Online High School will take you through some tips on answering paper one of the senior certificate examination, and that is grade 12. So if you are, prepping for your history examinations, then most certainly she will be giving you some, valuable tips in our history session today. Good afternoon, Danielle, and welcome to today's session.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So I know that last time we had you on, we never managed to go through all of paper one. So this is part two of that
Yeah,
revision session that's
right.
continuing now, and I hand over to you to commence.
Thank you. Okay, hi guys. So you'll remember that last week we kind of covered the first half of the paper one content. So that was the Cold War, and then the case study that was the Vietnam War. So we were busy doing this. And then today, what we're going to move on to is the second topic, which is the civil society protest topic. And what you specifically need to know here is the US civil rights movement. And then for the essay section, you will have to know the Black Power movement, but we will get there. Okay, so civil society protests between 1950 and 1990. I believe this will have either been probably your term one or term two work. Yeah. So it's important to know what civil society protest means. So, civil society protest has played a central role in affecting change and transformation in many countries. Okay, what is civil protest? Civil protest happens when ordinary citizens take action against government policies or situations that they consider unjust or unfair. For example, protest marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience, or strikes. Civil society protest often involves non-violent protest actions to influence public opinions. Okay, so why people engage in civil protest and kind of the background to it before we get into the US civil rights movement. So people want to make themselves heard and change aspects of society they found wrong. Societies in the USA and Europe became disillusioned with democratic institutions of government in the 1980s, so they were dissatisfied. The reasons for their dissatisfaction: the UN Charter of Human Rights states that all human beings are equal. Some groups felt that their rights were ignored and violated. They felt that the government didn't act in their best interest, and the institutions of democracy no longer had a link with people. There was a desire for social change as the war in Vietnam, environmental issues, feminism, disarmament of nuclear weapons, and the civil rights of Black Americans became the concerns of ordinary people. People wanted to get their concerns across. And in countries that didn't have democratic governments, civil society protest was the only way for people to get their message across. Since governments were oppressive in these countries, people took great risks when they embarked on civil protest campaigns. Protesters were often arrested or sent to prison. And then an example of civil protest in South Africa. Civil protests continued in South Africa during the 1960s to 1990s, and that led to the demise of the apartheid regime. Another example, civil society protest was common in Eastern Europe during the 1990s that brought a change from communism to democracy. Okay, so the introduction of peace movements, disarmament, students, and anti war movements as a precursor to the US civil rights movement. So the Cold War was at its height in the 1960s. The US and the USSR were engaged in an arm race. The US sent troops to Vietnam, but human rights were still ignored and violated. Peace movements were established because of the uncertainty and conflict during the 1960s. Movements involved civil society protests that included groups in favor of nuclear disarmament who wanted nuclear weapons to be destroyed, young people who called themselves hippies and were committed to love and peace, people who were against America's involvement in the Vietnam War, and nuclear weapons were possessed both by the USSR and by the US. The people feared that these weapons would be used in another war, and as such, a campaign for nuclear disarmament, CND, was formed in Britain in 1958. It advocated that nuclear weapons should be abolished, and activities included the following. So there were protest marches, people were convinced that weapons should be abolished, the Committee of 100 wanted more drastic measures, like breaking laws. Okay, so there were many campaigns and protests, and the campaign for nuclear disarmament had influenced many of the other peace protests. For example, the women's movement. The women's liberation movement can be traced to earlier times in history. During World War II, women were given important jobs for higher wages. After the war, the women were fired and the men were rehired after the men came back from the war. Women were paid less than men and were kept out of male occupations. A women's liberation movement emerged in the USA in the 1960s. Women were members of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. New laws were introduced that forbade job discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or sex. The American Women's Liberation Movement had class barriers. Okay. So the National Organization of Women, it included mainly white middle-class women. Thus, the National Domestic Workers Union was formed in 1968. Feminists adopted new tactics. Women were organized in discussion groups, a sheep was crowned as Miss America, women invaded all-male bars, and women discarded their high-heeled shoes, etc., things that resembled or symbolized the patriarchy. The 1960s was a decade which saw transformation in attitudes to authority, personal relationships, material standards, customs, and behavior. There were upheavals in class, race, and family relationships, and civil protests challenged government policies on nuclear arms, war, and education, and African Americans and women won civil rights for themselves. Okay, so the swinging 60s and the change in social norms. What brought about this change that we observe in social norms during these protests at the time? So there was a youth revolution as young people challenged their parents' ideas about music, religion, and dress code. As a rejection to the growing violence that was happening of the decade, young people rejected the values of conventional society and formed an alternative society called hippies. The hippies believed in a communal living and a commitment to peace and love. Many people were influenced by their ideas and fashions. The hippies refused to conform to the norms and the values of their parents. Long skirts, bell-bottom jeans, beads, and sandals were popular items of clothing. Hippies called themselves flower children, and they rejected materialism and refused to take part in the rat race for jobs and money. Hippies rejected all forms of violence, and the peace symbol became very popular. Rock and roll music was also very popular, for example, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And due to their parents' wealth, manufacturers began to make records, clothes, and other goods for them. The old standards were replaced by the rebellious mood of the swinging 60s. And then student protest, which was a very important part in civil rights movements. So how were young people involved in civil protest in the US? So the way young people dressed and the way in which they refused to conform to society was a way of protest. They thought that the world was violent and materialistic and that the culture would bring about a form of change. America's involvement in the Vietnam War made young people very active in civil rights protests against the use of nuclear weapons. Young people wanted to get their message across. They acted in the following ways. They burned their draft cards. So draft cards are what they send you, then you get drafted to go to war. So they burned those. Students held teachings. And the Vietnam War was called the War in the Evening News for the following reasons. It was the first war to be televised. Different images of war changed the way people felt about it. The war was confusing for American troops, and the anti-war movement played a crucial role in bringing the war to an end. The Vietnamese War had devastating effects on the lives of Americans and Vietnamese. President Nixon was compelled to withdraw US troops from Vietnam in 1971. And then they tell us that in Europe in 1968, it was a year of student revolution in West Germany, France, Italy, and Britain. Many students belonged to the New Left, a movement that supported a form of socialism. And then they tell us that one of the best incidents took place at Sorbonne University in France. Civil protests became violent as students fought battles with police. Factory workers also joined the riots and marches, and it was clear that students were prepared to engage in civil protest to bring about change. Now we get to the chunk of it, the actual stuff. The civil rights movement in the USA. You'll see I also made a little star next to it. The civil rights movement in the 20th century, so in the 1900s, involved protest campaigns to highlight issues such as racial segregation. The concept of civil rights encompasses the belief that all human beings have basic rights and liberties that cannot be violated by others or by the state. Civil rights activists organized resistance that included petitions, demonstrations, and civil disobedience. The Declaration of Independence only focused on the rights of white male Protestant property owners. Although African Americans became free citizens when slavery was abolished in 1865, they were denied their civil rights. African Americans had been struggling for equality since the late 1800s. Their protest actions against segregation and discrimination became a mass movement in the 1950s and 60s, known as the Civil Rights Movement. So despite the American Declaration of Independence, African Americans still experienced discrimination and inequality. Discrimination against Black people was more severe in the southern states due to the policy of slavery. When slavery was abolished in 1865, the rights of former slaves were not recognized. The Jim Crow laws in the southern states segregated public facilities and transport. African Americans were treated inferior due to the color of their skin. Okay, so the Jim Crow laws enforced the following segregation. Intermarriage between Black and white people was forbidden. Racial segregation resulted in separate schools, libraries, and restrooms. There was segregation on trains and buses, restaurants were segregated, and there was even different entrances for Black and white Americans. The KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, terrorized Black Americans. African Americans were lynched from trees, they were exposed to extreme acts of violence, and were intimidated by racist whites. The government officials and the police in the South did little to stop these attacks. Southerners were not prepared to treat Black people as equal, and then conversely, Black people in the North lived in slum areas. African Americans had to register to vote, whereas white Americans were automatically placed on the voters' roll, so they were automatically allowed to vote. And African Americans had to pass a literacy test before they were allowed to register as voters, and were intimidated when they did try to register. Okay, so how did the civil rights movement originate? So Black Americans became more aware of their racial discrimination after World War II. Organized civil protest was sparked off by an incident in Alabama in 1955, known as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. You guys need to know this. The Montgomery Bus Boycott is important. Rosa Parks, a seamstress, refused to move when boarding a bus. Seats at the back of the bus were reserved for Black people. She was arrested and fined, and in response to Rosa Parks' arrest, Black Americans organized a bus boycott, which lasted until 1956, so a year. And this was the first mass protest of the civil rights movement. And of course, LMK, Martin Luther King Jr., very important figure in the civil rights movement. Okay, so one of the leaders of the Montgomery Bus Boycott was Martin Luther King Jr. He became a spokesperson for African American rights and challenged racial segregation and injustice. Martin Luther King was a gifted speaker and inspired Americans to get involved in the movement. Okay, so the main point that you have to know between the difference of the leaders is Martin Luther King Jr. believed in non-violent protest and encouraged civil disobedience. He was influenced by the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi developed a philosophy of nonviolent resistance while he was involved in South Africa's Indian struggle for justice. He believed that unjust laws should be deliberately broken in a peaceful manner. A spiritual transformation was necessary before political change could be achieved, and the demonstrators needed to accept the hardships. Martin Luther King adapted Gandhi's passive resistance philosophy to match his Christian beliefs. Okay, so we get passive and active resistance. Active resistance is where it sometimes gets violent, and passive resistance is completely non-violent and just a less invasive form of protest. So in the civil rights movement, we see passive forms of protest, yet in the Black Power movement, we see a more active form of protest. Okay, so African American civil rights activists use civil disobedience as a way of drawing attention to the racial discrimination against African Americans. According to King, change could only happen if people were prepared to work for it. He organized campaigns such as marches and acts of civil disobedience to join and inspired others to join the movement. The following groups were inspired to join the civil rights movement. You have to know what these groups stand for. So students formed the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Congress for Racial Equality, CORE. Martin Luther King established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, in 1957, and the SCLC coordinated the activities of the groups that were dedicated to nonviolent protest against racial inequality. Martin Luther King Jr. gained the support of Black and white Americans. Okay, and then the different forms of protest. So most civil rights protest campaigns took place in the southern states, where racial discrimination was most prevalent. People involved in civil disobedience faced hostility by the police, and these protests were widely covered by the media, which made Americans aware of the civil rights issues. And then you'll see I numbered them, the important ones, which we will go through now. Okay, so the Montgomery Bus Boycott, we touched on it a bit earlier. So in response to the arrest of Rosa Parks on 1 December 1955, Black residents of Montgomery organized a bus boycott. A bus boycott was held on the 5th of December, the day of Rosa Parks' trial. Pamphlets were printed, and the slogan of the protest was, "Don't ride the bus today. Don't ride it for freedom." The bus boycott lasted 381 days, and the African American community remained determined and united. The bus company lost 75% of its revenue, and segregation on buses was made illegal in November 1956, and buses were desegregated the following month. The Montgomery Bus Boycott was a victory for the African Americans, and the idea of nonviolent protests became the cornerstone of the civil rights movement. So when you think of civil rights movement, think of nonviolent protests. Then secondly, sit-ins. So the first sit-in occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina on 1 February 1960. 4 Black students sat at a whites-only lunch counter at Woolworths on 2 February 1960 and were refused service. The protest was resumed the next day. Their actions inspired others, and within 2 weeks there were similar protests in 11 cities. Thousands of Black and white Americans joined in acts of civil disobedience to demand the desegregation of public facilities. Protesters stayed where they were when challenged by authorities and endured abuse without retaliation, so without fighting back. The Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were involved in a number of sit-ins between 1960 and 1964. Okay, then we get to the freedom rides. So although segregation on buses had been ruled unconstitutional, segregation was still practiced in the southern states. In May 1961, an interracial group of students traveled on a Greyhound bus from Washington to the South. These protests became known as freedom rides. The director, of course, of the Congress for Racial Equality was James Farmer. When the bus reached Anniston, Alabama, it was attacked by a mob of racists. A firebomb was thrown through the bus window and set the bus on fire. CORE organized many more freedom rides, and news reports made people aware of the abuse, and society became aware of the segregation that still existed. The protests spread to train stations and other buses, and the police could not protect the protesters, and extra pressure was placed on the Kennedy administration to end the violence. So on the US administration of the time. Black and white students sat together, segregation signs at segregated facilities were ignored. Freedom riders were arrested and jailed since they defied the Jim Crow laws. Segregation on interstate buses was made illegal in 1962. Okay, and then the last manner, which is protest campaigns and demonstrations. So the campaigns held in Birmingham and Washington in 1963 were two of the best known demonstrations against racism and segregation. Okay, the Birmingham campaign and the Washington March are very important to know, specifically the Washington March. This is one of the biggest civil rights protests in history. Okay, so Martin Luther King and the SCLC embarked on a protest campaign in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Birmingham was very racist. 17 churches and homes were bombed between 1957 and 1962. African Americans demanded the desegregation of public facilities and the right for blacks to attend all Southern universities. The campaign began on the 3rd of April with sit-ins and protest marches. The chief of police, Bull Connor, ordered the police use force to halt the demonstrations. Demonstrators were attacked with fire hoses, tear gas, and electric cattle prods. Police dogs were set loose, and some demonstrators were bitten. More than 3,300 African Americans were jailed. Intense media coverage made the American nation aware of the brutal attacks, and as such, the support for the civil rights movement grew. Birmingham business leaders decided the protest action was bad for business and desegregated lunch counters, restrooms, and drinking fountains. Charges against the protesters were dropped. Segregation still continued, however, and the Washington March was planned. Okay, so the Washington March on the 28th of August, 1963. Okay, so Philip Randolph, a civil rights leader, suggested a march to Washington, D.C. He believed that the pace of segregation was too slow and that African Americans were denied jobs. The march became known as the March to Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Randolph, King, and 4 other civil rights activists organized the march to the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, why the Lincoln Memorial? It was symbolic because it was 100 years after slavery, and Abraham Lincoln signed the law removing slavery, and as such, they were marching to the Lincoln Memorial. President Abraham Lincoln signed a proclamation freeing slaves in the USA on 28 August 1863. The march gained support from diverse sectors of the American society, so from all sectors of the American society. There were buses and trains that were hired to transport demonstrators. More than 250,000 demonstrators took part in the march. The Lincoln March became the biggest demonstration ever held in the US. The crowds met at the Washington Memorial and they marched to the Lincoln Memorial. Demonstrators listened to speeches by civil rights leaders. The highlight of the afternoon was King's I Have a Dream speech. This is a very famous speech. You guys should go look it up on YouTube. In this speech, King linked the emancipation of the slaves to the fact that Americans didn't have constitutional rights. He reminded the listeners that the American Constitution guaranteed all Americans the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. King explained his vision for a nation free from racial prejudice. In response to this march, the President Kennedy proposed a law to end discrimination. However, after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson completed Kennedy's vision of civil rights for all. The Civil Rights Act was signed on 2 July 1964. The law banned segregation based on race, color, religion, or national origin. Okay, and then the Selma Montgomery marches. And this was so that people could vote, the main point of these marches. And there were a few of these Selma Montgomery marches. Okay, so despite the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, very few African Americans were registered to vote. Voter registration among African Americans was slow, and they faced intimidation from white supremacists. Martin Luther King and the SCLC, so the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, decided to hold a campaign in Alabama to bring attention to the discrimination that African Americans faced in regards to voter registration. The campaign was launched in Selma, Alabama. Only 350 of the 15,000 African American residents had registered to vote because of a threat of violence and difficult literacy tests that were meant to keep the Black population from voting. The campaign started with a mass meeting held in Selma on 2 January 1965. 100 African American school teachers marched to the Selma courthouse and demanded to register to vote. Children were inspired by their teachers' actions. A night march was held on 18 February 1965 from the church to the jail in Marion, a town near Selma. Marchers were attacked by state troopers, and in response to the violence that was used by the state troopers, another protest march was planned from Selma to Montgomery. The police reacted in a violent way, and three separate marches took place during March 1965. Okay, so 3 marches. The first march, 7 March 1965. A group of about 600 protesters left Selma on 7 March to Montgomery. Alabama state troopers confronted the marchers as they approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge across the Alabama River. The crowd was ordered to disperse, but marches continued. Protesters were attacked with batons, cattle prods, whips, and tear gas. The brutal attack was televised and outraged many Americans. The incident became known as Bloody Sunday. Okay, and then the second march on 9 March 1965. So Martin Luther King called on Americans to join him on a second march. On 9 March, King led 1,500 people from Selma to Montgomery, but was confronted by state troopers. He decided to turn back in order to avoid confrontation because of what happened with the first march, and there was a growing public concern regarding the injustices taking place in Alabama. The authorities were ordered not to stop the protesters who were taking part in the third march on the 21st of March. Okay, so the 21st to the 25th of March. A third march was held on the 21st of March. President Johnson sent state troopers to protect the marchers, who began a 3-day, 87-kilometer journey. When they reached Montgomery on 24 March, the crowd had grown to 25,000 people. In response to the Selma-Montgomery marches, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act on 6 August 1965. Every American citizen now had the right to vote. And then another poignant issue before we get to the Black Power movement. We'll see how much time we have to do this. But the school desegregation, and a prime example of this was Little Rock, Arkansas. So segregation at schools in the USA was based on the doctrine of separate but equal, but white schools were still better funded by the state than black schools. This was also observed in apartheid in South Africa. Segregation at schools was challenged by a lawsuit, Brown versus the Board of Education. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, took the took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court ruled in favor of the Browns. The U.S. government ruled in favor of integrated schools, but the southern states still wanted to segregate their schools. An incident took place in Little Rock, Arkansas, on 4 September 1957. 9 African American students were prevented from enrolling at a white school. The Supreme Court sent federal troops to protect the students, and the white population of Little Rock were furious. Tension was evident. And then this is also very important to know, the short and long-term gains of the civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King Jr. inspired thousands of black and white Americans to participate in campaigns of civil disobedience between 1955 and 1956. Signing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act were important gains, and the movement had successfully ended racial segregation in the South, but did not address racial discrimination in the North. Prejudice did not disappear, and many Americans rejected King's philosophy of nonviolence. Therefore, because of these 2 reasons, people adopted the slogan, Black Power. That brings us to the Black Power movement. Okay, so where the civil rights movement had focused on cooperation and reconciliation between black and white Americans, inequalities still remained. Most African Americans lived in slum areas, and inadequate transport made it difficult for people to take jobs far from their homes. African Americans were poor, and some African American people were disillusioned with the civil rights movement and believed King's philosophy of nonviolence was too moderate. They wanted to accelerate the pace, and therefore the Black Power movement gained popularity in the 1960s. African Americans believed that using violence was justified in gaining equality, and Black Power instilled a feeling of racial pride and self worth in African Americans. Malcolm X was an advocate for Black Power. He maintained that African Americans needed to fight for equal rights, even if it meant having to use violence. Okay, so the big names: Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and obviously Martin Luther King Jr. for the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, then the Black Panthers. So the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, BPP, was formed in 1966 to protect African American neighborhoods from police brutality. The Black Panthers wanted African Americans to carry guns to defend themselves. They were involved in multiple police shootouts in the 1960s and 1970s, and many whites felt threatened by the idea of Black Power. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense launched programs to help alleviate poverty in Black communities. Firstly, a free breakfast for children program fed thousands of poor and hungry Black children every day. Secondly, they established clinics where people could get medical care. Thirdly, a tutoring scheme was set up to help Black learners succeed at school. And lastly, the BPP drew up a 10-point program that demanded full employment and an end to capitalism that disadvantaged the African American community, decent housing and education for African Americans, an end to police brutality, the release of African Americans held in jail, and the Black Panthers became very popular in the 1960s as it protected the rights of Black workers and African communities in the ghettos where they were vulnerable to police brutality and police attacks. And then the two major players of the Black Power movement, Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X. So Carmichael was motivated to join the civil rights movement when he saw the bravery of those involved in the sit-ins. Carmichael joined the SNCC and became a freedom writer. Carmichael's ideas of passive resistance changed in 1966 after the death of James Meredith, a civil rights activist. Carmichael urged African American people to take pride in being Black. He wanted African Americans to recognize their heritage. Carmichael joined the Black Panther Party and promoted Black Power. Malcolm X played a crucial role in the Black Power movement. He was a member of the Nation of Islam, NOI, a Muslim group that believed the whites were deliberately preventing African Americans from empowering themselves. Malcolm X became one of the leaders of Nation of Islam and believed that there couldn't be any integration between the whites and Blacks. They believed separation was necessary so that Black people no longer depended on the whites. And the membership of the Nation of Islam grew from 500 in 1952 to 30,000 in 1963. Malcolm X's attitude became less militant, so less aggressive, after a pilgrimage in 1963 to 1964, and he founded the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, in 1964. He started to believe not all whites were evil. Malcolm X was assassinated on 21 February 1965 by Black nationalists. Okay, and then the short and long-term gains of the Black Power movement. So the approach of the Black Power movement led to outbreaks of violence between 1965 and 1969, so this is the main period. These riots highlighted the discrimination that African Americans faced in the northern states, and this led to change and reform. As these riots continued in the Black communities, President Johnson appointed a commission in 1968 to investigate the causes of the riots. It was found that unemployment, poor housing, police brutality, and inadequate schools were to blame and caused frustration among the Black Americans. A program of reform was set up to eradicate discrimination, and the Black Power movement encouraged Black pride. Okay, so if we think about the Black Power movement and its effects today, it makes us think a lot about Black Lives Matter, right? Even the symbol is the same. The Black Power movement symbol is the raised fist, which is the same symbol they use for the Black Lives Matter movement. So oftentimes try draw comparisons between the history that we just did and how society is currently looking and functioning. Because you'll notice that a lot of these things are still poignant and like issues in our society, right? We're still fighting discrimination. We're still watching the Black Lives Matter protests go on and on. And so it's important that you tie the work that you're learning in history to real life because it is real life. We're not just learning theory, these things actually happen, right? So I just wanted to rehash for the civil rights movement, you have to know that it was passive resistance, and for the Black Power movement, you have to know it was active resistance, and it was Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. And then for the civil rights movement, it was Martin Luther King Jr. And then, yeah, that's it for today on this section of the paper one. Thank you so much for attending the class. And then probably in the next sessions, we'll be going through the paper two content for the history paper two.
Yeah, the PC froze there for a moment, so I was struggling to get back into the stream. But thank you so much for today's session. Thank you to you, the viewer, for viewing, and remember to like and share the session. For now, we bid you farewell. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.